Good evening. This evening, the panel that we have here before us is sponsored by the Energy and Environment Center, Policy Center, and we are looking at what may well be one of the most crucial issues of this or any other generation. Anybody who is engaged in policy making, policy analysis, public life, will know that if we are persuaded that the subject of global warming is one that we need to take seriously, if we believe the argument of many scientists that we are in at the present time for a period of profound climatic change, then the implications of that are probably as great as any other revolution that we have faced in the last 120 or 150 years. The implications for politics, for economics, for policy making, for all our countries are profound. But of course a lot of argument revolves around the issue of just how seriously and just how deeply the safety and security of our planet is threatened by it. So tonight we're delighted to have with us a panel to discuss this issue. And we'll start, if I may, with our two of our scientists. First of all, Professor Edward Wilson, who is sitting at the far end of the panel, who is a distinguished entomologist and an expert on the subject of biodiversity, the great range of species that inhabit this planet along with ourselves. And we will ask him to speak first, and he will then be followed by Professor Michael McElroy, who was educated in Northern Ireland and is now the Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and the Chairman of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences here at Harvard, and who is one of the experts on the whole subject of climatic change. I will introduce the other two speakers after that, so that you remember all that needs to be said about them. But I will first of all invite, if I may, Professor Wilson and then Professor Michael McElroy to speak to this audience. And we aren't going to speak at great length. Each speaker is being asked to speak for 12 to 15 minutes as a maximum, so that there'll be plenty of times for questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
The secular environmental changes that have largely held our attention are ozone depletion, climatic warming, and toxic pollution. But in my view, these are, while important, relatively minor for the long haul of human history compared to the fourth of these environmental horsemen of the apocalypse, namely mass species extinction due to habitat destruction, but probably in the northern latitudes eventually also due to climatic warming. I would propose to simply give now a series of facts and relatively solidly based estimates concerning the issue of the biodiversity crisis, that is, the loss of diversity of life at the species level and of genetic strains within species due to human activity. There are at present time known with a scientific name about 1.4 million species of organisms, plants, animals, and microorganisms. But we know from random collecting here and there that the number of species is actually vastly larger. The great majority of species of organisms on Earth are unknown to science, do not even have a scientific name. Estimates run from a conservative 5 million or so to as many as 50 million or more actually in existence. This is a poorly explored planet biologically. We believe that more than one-half of the species of organisms on Earth live in the tropical rainforest, this magical hothouse of evolution and diversity, which covers only 6% of the land surface. A large part of the remaining species fractions exist in the coral reefs, the tropical coral reefs. Unfortunately, these are the two major biome types, the terrestrial and the marine, respectively, which are suffering the greatest degradation and erosion through human activity. Without going into the arguments, which I will be glad to present if documentation is required, and I might add that this is a relatively non-controversial set of conclusions. It has not, like some of the environmental changes, been the center yet of controversy. It is the subject of substantial unanimity among the students of biodiversity that what I'm about to say is not far off. That if in the forest loss, tropical forest loss, continues at the present rate at about 1% of the total cover, or about 100,000 square kilometers per year, we will lose as much and possibly considerably more than 1/4 of all of the species of organisms on Earth within the next 50 years, unless that is abated. Now, this is the really important environmental change that we are wreaking upon the Earth, because it is not reversible. This is the greatest extinction spasm now undergoing. I estimate that the extinction rate is at least 10,000 times now greater than the normal background extinction rate before the coming of man. It is the greatest extinction spasm that has occurred in the last 65 million years. There have been approximately 5 major extinction spasms, natural ones, that is, of course, having nothing to do with humanity, during the past 600 million years. The last was 65 million years ago. That closed the age of dinosaurs. The one that is now occurring is lifespan of between 1 and 10 million years, according to the group that they belong to. Each one is, in most cases, at least in the case of the eukaryotic organisms, the higher organisms, the ones that make up the vast bulk of living diversity, they have in their genetic code between 1 and 10 billion bits of information. So that what we are allowing to slip away at the rate of many thousands of species per year and accelerating is a veritable library of genetic information hammered out by an astronomical number of events in mutation, recombination, and natural selection, which no laboratory, no supercomputer can conceivably ever duplicate, much less fit together into the complex and exquisitely balanced ecosystems that have required tens of millions of years to evolve. Why should we care about the loss of half the species on Earth? I'm asked this question more often than any other. I've been asked it by senators, by media people, and I'm always taken aback by this question. Isn't there some sense of decency or morality about the future of the world that one would not ask why we should allow this to disappear? Well, the answers that one produces, biologists have fortunately a front line of answers which are very valid, namely of practical nature, namely that the biological diversity of the world is a great resource. And it is also a particularly great resource for the third world countries that have the tropical forest and coral reefs, and much more than half of the diversity of life on Earth in them. They are perhaps dollars poor, but biologically extremely rich. So they should be the ones most concerned with saving their national heritage. And from that, in purely practical reasons, can be drawn, and we have whole libraries of examples now and technologies that have been developed to some extent that shows how to make this possible, both the means through scientific exploration, development, marketing, and the like. They are the source of potential source of vast numbers of new pharmaceuticals, of new crops, some of which demonstrably superior to the ones that are in widespread use, new fibers, new petroleum substitutes, and so on and on. But beyond merely the question of the opportunity cost, which are enormous and a debt that cannot be made up, a deficit that cannot be made up, if we do not bring this to a halt or abate it, there is, of course, the ethical question, and the one that I like to use a parallel. It's very much as though one came upon the Louvre and found a group of people in charge of the Louvre with half the paintings out on the road, and they're burning them to cook dinner. And you say, why are you doing this? Well, we need to cook our dinner. And it doesn't matter because we'll still have half the art treasures of the Louvre left when we finish.
Professor Michael McElroy.
Ed Wilson is always a very hard act to follow. What I'd like to do is to give a little sense of history about the changes that we're now concerned about on the Earth. And it really has been a remarkable several years. It's a time when we had the famous debate about Boston Harbor, and we had the environment as a key issue in the presidential debate. We've had meetings convened internationally in the last several years by President Mitterrand, by Gorbachev, by the Japanese government, by the Pope, and a great friend of Shirley Williams, Margaret Thatcher. So there have been many born-again environmentalists in this particular area of global change. We're still waiting for Mr. Sununu to join the club. Let me try in a few brief minutes to give you a sense of what has happened in the past history of our planet that is relevant to this issue of global change, and then discuss what I think we know for sure, and then raise the issues of uncertainty and perhaps what we might do by way of framing a sensible policy response to that. First of all, there's no question that change is in the nature of the planet. Change in the composition of the atmosphere, change in climate, is intrinsically part of the way our planet functions. And we've been very fortunate in the last several years to have a sense of the historical context in which to view the changing composition of the atmosphere of the planet. Now, we're concerned, among other things, with changes in so-called greenhouse gases, the gases which are responsible for keeping the Earth relatively warm. And let me give you a little bit of history about carbon dioxide, one of the ones of concern today. We know that during the past million years or so of the planet's history, the level of atmospheric CO2 was about 200 parts per million during ice ages, 280 parts per million during interglacial periods, 200, 280, and that today is 350, and in the lifetime of the people in this room, we'll be at 650 and climbing. No question about it. That's going to happen. Second point is the rapidity with which the change has taken place. We have a beautiful record of the composition of the atmosphere, which we can read, just like the library, by looking at gases trapped in ice cores drilled from Antarctica and Greenland. We can look back in time, year by year, at the history of our planet. Not much happens. Things are changing relatively gently until you get to about roughly the period of the Industrial Revolution. Then CO2 begins to take off. So it's very important to have a sense of the rapidity of the change. It's not slow, it's very rapid. Another gas which is involved in the chemistry of the atmosphere from the climatic point of view and also from the point of view of ozone and even the quality of the air that you breathe is methane. Second most abundant carbon constituent of the atmosphere, natural gas, increasing at a prodigiously rapid rate, almost 2% per year at the moment, 300 parts per billion during ice ages, 600 during interglacials, 1,800 today. And that also started very recently. More bothersome, we don't understand why the concentration of methane is going up. We can point the finger at issues that are directly related to population. Rice cultivation provides a wonderful environment for methane production. Cattle population tracks the human population. But there's more than that. I don't believe that that explains the prodigiously rapid rate of rise. There are interactions with the atmospheric ability to remove, to scavenge gases, which I think ultimately are being affected by tropical development of the nature that Professor Wilson talked about, that is in fact causing a flock of gases that we're inserting into the atmosphere, like methane, to stay there much longer. Concentration rising, consequences which really must be dealt with in a very serious way. Now, climate change. What do we know about climate change? Well, quite clearly we had ice ages on this planet, and we had warm interglacial periods in the recent history of the planet. Ice ages, for many people in this area, they're quite unaware of the fact that 15,000 years ago, an instant in geological time, on the 4th of July, outside here, you could walk on a kilometer-thick level of ice. So the nature of change, the reality of change, is dramatically evident in the geologic record. People are not also aware that we've had little changes, except they're not really that little. Beginning about 300 years ago, the world, we used to think it was just Northern Europe, moved into a period which is now referred to as the Little Ice Age. And that was the time when Bruegel painted his paintings. It's a time when art records scenes that are not accessible today in Europe. And now we realize the Little Ice Age was a global phenomenon. And in 1860, approximately, the Little Ice Age ended. And it didn't end slowly. It ended in about 3 years. And it ended globally in about 3 or 4 years. All of the mountain glaciers from New Zealand through the equatorial region, through Hawaii to Alaska, went pop like that in 3 years. And we don't really understand what was going on. Now let me address the issue of uncertainty. There's no question that the composition of the atmosphere is changing. That's not an issue. There's no question that these gases affect the climate. That's not an issue. The only question is, can we make a confident prediction about what we think is going to happen? We're at the moment at the mercy of large computer models. We're at the mercy of our inability to really focus on the key feedbacks that are really essential in regulating the way in which the climate system works. And so you can take the view that Mr. Sununu has taken, that we don't know enough to really make policy. And you can then have the curious situation where 3 governments in The Hague, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Japan, take the view that we don't know enough, or for different reasons we should not take any action to slow down the pace of change. Soviet Union, as I've been informed at least, the Soviet Union took that view at The Hague that global warming would probably be good for them. The United States, reflecting the views of the science advisor, Mr. Sununu, took the view that we don't know enough and we need to study it a little more before we take any position. The Japanese, on the other hand, said that, well, they're doing pretty well, and the United States is very wasteful in energy, so they're not going to do anything until we sort of fix up our house. But at the same time, it's very important, it seems to me, to recognize that uncertainty is a two-edged sword. And the view that some people have that necessarily global warming, which most people think is going to happen, there are no serious scientific objections to the possibility of warming. There have been a lot of stuff in the newspapers, but there's nothing serious in the way of commentary on errors in the thinking about global warming. The conservative view says it will happen slowly. The sea level will slowly rise. We will raise the level of our dikes, and we won't even know that we're doing it. And the climate will be such that our agricultural systems will adjust in a straightforward way. Our trade imbalances will shift and change. That's the conservative view, which says that you can afford to take time. But now let's think about the Little Ice Age and the end of the Little Ice Age. 3 years. We have the potential, remember, and I don't say this is going to happen, but we have the potential to raise sea level by 20 feet. If that were to happen in the worst case scenario rapidly, it's a disaster for large parts of the world. It's even a disaster for the first world. I don't think that one can say it's going to happen. But now let's think about what constitutes a sensible policy. In my view, policy should be directed to slowing down the pace of change. It is absurd to waste fossil fuel energy the way we do. It is absurd to destroy tropical forests. It is absurd not to have a view of the common interdependence of humankind. It is absurd to have a throwaway society and to assume that somehow or other nature will take care of it and we will be okay. The lessons that Ed Wilson talked about, I think, are important in this sense here also. Nature knows how to take care of those who do not respect nature. Species do become extinct. The important thing here is that we make proper and correct policy decisions that will avoid that particular fate for us. Thank you.
Ed Wilson and Michael McElroy have described the threat that may face our planet, and I think all of us have in the back of our minds the picture of that extraordinarily fragile little globe on which we live, which we remember from the first moon landings. We're now going to ask Bill Clark and Dr. Richard Benedict to address some of the policy answers, or perhaps the policy conundrums that are lying out there. Bill Clark is, as you know, a member of the Kennedy School faculty. He works in the science and technology policy concentration area, and he has been particularly identified in recent years with the issue of global warming. He's on the United States National Academy of Science Committee for Global Change. He's on the steering committee of the United Nations Programme on Global Warming, and he's the co-editor of the Environment and the Sustainable, and has written a book, or co-edited a book, on the sustainable development of the biosphere. And one of his major contributions has been in the whole area of trying to match the problems of economic growth with the problems of its impact on the planet. After Bill, we will turn to Richard Benedict, who is a senior fellow at the Conservation Society and the World Wildlife Fund, who was for over 30 years a member of, and is indeed still a member of the State Department, and had a very distinguished career in that office. He was in a number of, it's not a joke, a number of world hotspots in the 50s and 60s, serving in Iran and Pakistan, among other countries. And then in 1979, he was appointed by President Carter to look after the government's concerns with the whole area of population affairs, and was in fact the coordinator of population affairs, a difficult and controversial area in which to work. In 1984, he moved on to another one and became in charge of the policy formulation area of the Department of Environment as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And in that role, he was concerned with acid rain, he was concerned with tropical forests, he was concerned with AIDS, and with many other issues that cross national frontiers. In that capacity, he was the United States' senior member of the delegation that attended the Montreal Convention, which finally brought about some considerable improvement in the thinning of the ozone layer by controlling, among other things, CFCs. So I will ask first Bill Clark and then Richard Benedict to speak about the policy issues that our two scientists have presented so dramatically.
It seems to me that a different way of reading the charge of this forum, how endangered is the planet? Well, how it's endangered is clearly through human activities. And if we look as we try to understand why the threats or the risks that Drs. Wilson and McElroy have described are emerging, it is not oversimplifying too much to say that there are two kinds of human events or human actions that lead to most of these current and potential future difficulties. One is the parts of the world and the people for which there's too much poverty. The other is the parts of the world and the people for whom there's too much wealth. To take Dr. Wilson's image, we're out there burning half of the pictures in the Louvre, but a quarter of them, folks are out there burning because they got to cook and they need something to heat the pot because they got nothing else, no other way to eat. The other quarter of them are being burned by people for their own amusement because they don't have anything else to do. And until we begin to understand these very different sources of both the current and the potential future threats to the planet, we are radically restricted in our ability to think through both technically possible and morally acceptable approaches to formulating policies and decisions to address them. Fortunately, I have an expert on what you actually do in the real world to my right here. So I am saved the problem of being practical, and will simply try to, as a prelude to Dr. Benedict's talk, simply remind you of the dimensions of the human side of the environment problems that my two colleagues have so accurately described. Because the reality of the situation is we can't solve the environment problems without solving the human problems at the same time. Like it or not, we've moved over the last several decades into a situation when the environment of this planet and its human population are intimately intertwined with each other. Each is a determinant of the other's fate. We didn't choose that, but we've got it, and we are faced with the issue of managing, explicitly or implicitly, consciously or unconsciously, that very profound set of interactions. Well, what kind of interactions are they from the people side? That is, if we're going to preserve species, not destroy the climate and the ozone layer on the one hand, what are the objectives or the goals we've got to meet on the people side? Well, start with, as you all know, we have a planet that today has something on the order of 5+ billion people. That population has doubled over most of your lifetimes. Those 5 billion people appropriate on the order of 40% of all the organic matter fixed by photosynthesis on land on the planet. They appropriate it for their own activities or waste. 40% of the planet's terrestrial primary production. Each of those people, on average, uses something on the order of 20 times their weight in coal each year. Each person, on average, uses something on the order of 2 times their weight in steel. Now, clearly, the big issue is that those usages, as impressive and frightening as they are not distributed evenly over the planet. They're distributed, both their benefits for people and their pressures on the environment, with radical differences from place to place. The richest 15% of the planet's people consume over half of its energy and a third of its fertilizer. The poorest 25% go to bed hungry in some season of the year. More than a third of those 5 billion people live in countries where the infant mortality rate is over 1 in 10. And that is against a world of 1 in 200 or better in which most of you have grown up. And the absolutely profound impacts of the difference between a world in which 1 in 10 of the children you meet die before reaching age 5 and 1 in 200, and the problems we've got to resolve on the human side while respecting these environmental limits are attention getting enough. As we look to the future, we face a situation where sometime in the next century we're liable to face a world of 10 billion people, twice what we have today. Nearly all of the growth to that 10 billion will be in today's poor countries. That is, will be in places where the problems of environment are problems of too much poverty, of burning the pictures to cook your food, not burning the pictures to amuse yourselves. The World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, estimated a couple of years ago that in order to provide the absolute minimum basic human requirements for those 10 billion people, we were going to need to see a 5 to 10-fold increase in world economic product over the same 50 years by the middle of the next century. And the implications of this absolutely desperately needed economic growth for an already highly stressed planetary environment are, as my predecessors on the forum have said, at a minimum frightening and potentially absolutely catastrophic. Now, facing this kind of a balance of human needs and environmental limits, what do? Well, there's a simple layer of answers and there's a hard layer of answers. The simple layer, I think, can be summed up in 3 requirements. We have got to make both the knowledge and the means necessary for control of population growth at levels that people want available universally around the world yesterday. Secondly, we've got to find ways of promoting sufficiently vigorous economic growth and sufficiently equitable distribution of its benefits, that the basic needs of these 5 coming on 10 billion people can be met in a way that is humane and simply morally acceptable to us as other humans that share the planet. But third, we've got to find a way of structuring this economic growth and its generation of benefits in a way that does not transcend a set of environmental limits which unfortunately we only vaguely and broadly at the present understand. Now those are the simple things we somehow have to find a way to doing. As we look to what might we in fact do to accomplish them, again, Dr. Benedict, having had the virtue of actually done some of this work, will bring you down to the specifics of reality. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that virtually any long-term successful strategy we look at is going to have at least 4 components. In the area of basic information, what's going on, what is this interaction between people and their environments, we got to know it better. We got to understand this interaction infinitely better than we do now. And there are 2 kinds of that. The need for just plain basic research, basic scientific knowledge that says more fluorocarbons lead to more ozone depletion, not to less, and so on, even enough to make Mr. Sununu see the way. That is a requirement we have today. I know it's impossible, but any reasonable person to see the way. It is a requirement we will have 20 years from now and 50 years from now, but the investments have to be made 20 years ago. What ones we forgot to make then have got to be made instantly. But there's a comparable set of information, and broadly it's economic information. That is, the kinds of signals people going about their daily business get back from the environment. We have to find ways of making prices include somewhat more of the environmental costs of the things we do. That may be difficult, but at a minimum, we have to find ways of including in our accounts of prices, national income accounts and the like, decent ways of tallying out the difference between a standing forest producing each year a certain cullable amount of wood that can be sustained into the future, giving generations into the future benefit streams, as well as maintaining biodiversity and climate, which is currently valued at 0 as a productive resource in virtually every economic account in the world. And in contrast, a kind of economic accounts that will not let you get a net benefit to the landless peasant pushed by population pressure and so on to go cut forests. They are the direct result of explicit government subsidies and taxation policies that systematically drive by government convention people to do these things. Now, we may have a real hard time fixing population issues, but it defies imagination to know why we should push off onto the hard and morally very difficult issue of population the much easier thing of we're deforesting those questions because we've passed government policies that might as well read, we do this policy in order to deforest the tropics. So we need information. Clearly, we need technologies to match. Appropriate technology is a phrase that has been passed around for nigh on 30 years now, has gotten a at least bucolic, if not bad, name as being something that people who can't do real technology do. But the real challenge, in fact, the challenge, if you want, of engineering over the next 20 or 30 years is going to be using the absolutely furthest limits of knowledge and technical expertise we can marshal, but having the humility to recognize that its applicability, the form in which it is usable by real people, is going to differ from place to place around the world. Combining that expertise with a place-sensitive awareness of its usability, and moving on not with an anti-technology, but a very pro-technology move, because that is one of the very few policy levers we've got to get out of many of these dilemmas we're in. Third, as Ambassador Benedict will surely discuss, we need a set of institutional mechanisms that allow us to do better coordination both domestically and internationally. And then finally, an issue that is a need that is often left off lists of this sort. I suspect we need an effort, if that's the right word, much more determined than we've had in the last 10 or 15 years to create public visions, publicly shared visions of what a sustainable world might look like. That is, visions, pictures, if you will, of what a world of the year 2020 or 2050, which gave an adequate level of human well-being to the people in that world and a level of environmental protection, crudest sense, to both the patterns and processes of the environment. Right now, we debate almost all of our choices purely in the context of a little more tax there, a little more regulation here. We're doing fine-tuning at the edges, which is great if we're close to the solution, but it's a horrible way to establish a national or international debate on where we might like to be. Various countries have gone a long direction towards beginning to shape these visions. 8 years ago in Sweden, the bestseller at Christmas time was a book called Painting the Future, which their best landscape artists had teamed up with a team of roughly their National Academy of Science to paint a set of 5 landscapes of Sweden back through 5,000 years of history and up through the next 100 years of history under different development paths that Sweden might choose. The National Labor Union took this as its annual Christmas gift, sent it all around the country, and it stimulated a very constructive and positive debate on what kind of a painted future did the country want. West Germany, after going in the early 80s through a period of extraordinary divisiveness in what shall we do about environment versus industry and so on, to the level you could barely raise the issues for fear that someone would say, oh, we can't touch that, the Greens might get it. The Greens would touch it and say, oh, we can't do that because it'll support the hard progress bloc, managed to form, of all things, a presidential commission, their equivalent, an enquête commission, that addressed the greenhouse issue as a joint product of the science community, the senior people in Parliament, the senior people in industry, and came out with, heaven help us, a national strategy on what information, technology, and directions had to be taken. Again, visions of where Germany wanted to be. Even in the Soviet Union, the first Congress of People's Deputies, where I think several of us in this room happened to be in the country at the time, ended up in the midst of what would appear to have been a debate about whether democracy, freedom, and so forth in this country, in fact, focused tremendously on issues of what kind of world do we locally and globally want to live in? What do we want our landscapes to look at? How can we build at least enough control over our own lives to control the appearance, the landscapes, the atmospheric quality, the healthfulness of the world we grow up in? Those debates are moving along in many countries. They are barely starting to be formed, shaped, discussed in this country. I think it's one of the most exciting areas that we're likely to see developing in the 90s, and is the kind of thing in which particularly students attending this institution, I think, have a tremendous role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will finally ask Ambassador Richard Benedict to conclude the panel's remarks, and then we'll open it to questions and discussion.
I actually was also in Russia very recently, and while I was there, I heard a speech by President Gorbachev on the environment. He came to address an international conference on environmental issues, and it was on the Friday night that he was preoccupied with what was practically civil war in Azerbaijan, but he nevertheless stuck to his schedule, and he came and he gave at the Supreme Soviet a speech on the environment which was so far-sighted and yet so specific that I would recommend to Bill Clark that he take that speech by Gorbachev and print it in his journal, Environment, and alongside of it run the speech by our president that was delivered 2 weeks ago before a climate conference with no further comment. I actually think it's no great coincidence that these social and political upheavals are taking place around the world, as we've seen in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and China, at the same time that there's a great wave of ecological consciousness that's sweeping around the peoples of the world. I think they're both rooted in a common cause, and that is a basic desire of humanity to regain control of its own destiny. I think there's a realization that has been fueled, that has been greatly contributed to by scientists such as those that I have the honor of sharing this podium with today, a realization that the material goals of modern society are somehow inadequate, that the short-term preoccupations of our nations with ideological or military or economic or political goals, political objectives, that these short-term viewpoint is not only somehow unsatisfying to the human spirit, but is even dangerous to the planet. And that the policies that our modern societies have become used to, industrial, agricultural, energy, and consumption patterns, that these are beginning to endanger a planet which turns out to be much more fragile than we had originally thought. And that these decisions, these are not grand, sweeping kinds of events. They are rooted in the day-to-day decisions of people all over the world, ranging from using a hairspray that's propelled by chlorofluorocarbons in a spray can to building a road through a forest. That the gradual accumulation of these individual decisions or societal decisions is leading up to a situation where the possibility of an ecological collapse has become real and not just the nightmare of science fiction writers. Now, I think it was a British historian who once observed that all revolutions seem impossible before they happen and inevitable after they occur. And I'd like to tell you a little bit tonight about some of my own experience with a diplomatic treaty which most knowledgeable observers at the time thought would be impossible to achieve, even though diplomacy is supposed to be the art of the possible. Well, this turned out to be something that was, by all accounts, impossible. And it was, in many respects, unique in the annals of international diplomacy. As all of you know, it mandated significant reductions in some very useful chemicals that had been growing very rapidly in international trade and in consumption, that were used in a wide variety of industries, and that were in many ways associated with products that are synonymous with modern standards of living. They were products which accounted for hundreds of billions of dollars of investment worldwide, hundreds of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of jobs. With all of this, however, scientists suspected that this man-made chemical, chlorofluorocarbons, and a related family of halons, could do damage to a remote, unstable, and highly toxic gas, namely ozone, which was found predominantly 6 to 30 miles above the Earth's surface, and that the destruction of this gas, of ozone, this ozone layer, could allow dangerous levels of ultraviolet radiation to reach the Earth's surface. Ultraviolet radiation which has the capability of damaging and causing mutations in animal and plant cells. So one could say that the ozone layer, as it's currently constituted, is absolutely vital to the evolution of life as it has occurred on the planet. However, these were just speculative theories, just like the theories on climate change. They were in the models of rather arcane models of scientists. There were many scoffers and skeptics at the ozone depletion theory, just as there are today, especially in the White House, on the climate change hypotheses. There had been no measured evidence at the time of the negotiations of any loss of ozone, of any depletion in the ozone layer worldwide. There was the Antarctic ozone hole, to be sure, but there were many theories about that. It didn't conform to the models. It could have been something uniquely attributable to the conditions over the Antarctic. There was no evidence that chlorine was involved, and even if chlorine was involved, there was no proof that it would happen elsewhere. These were just theories. There was no evidence, moreover, of ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth's surface of increased levels. There was, to be sure, increased skin cancer, but that was attributable to life cycles, styles and changing consumption patterns, people moving to southern areas and so on. But in terms of measurements, the only measurements that existed of ultraviolet radiation showed, if anything, a decrease and not the postulated increase. And similarly, the Antarctic ozone hole, at the time that we started the negotiations in 1986, had just diminished in size, thereby reducing any implication that there may have been a danger from CFCs, because CFCs were still increasing, and yet the Antarctic ozone hole actually declined in 1986. I think perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Montreal Protocol was that the international community was able to agree to impose some substantial short-term costs on these very useful chemicals and on very significant industries in order to protect humanity as a whole against dangers that were speculative, long-term, and future, much in the future. It was not, like most environmental agreements, a preventive action. It was not a remedial action. It was a preventive action on a global scale. And this was the first time, really, that anything like this had happened. Now, admittedly, climate change is more complicated than the ozone layer, but the differences, I feel, are more quantitative than qualitative. There are some unique challenges to international cooperation. Because of the uncertainty over the impacts of climate change, there's still some feeling that some countries might be winners or losers, as has been referred to. There were some people, and there still are in the Soviet Union, who think that they might gain by a warming, and this is true in other countries as well. In addition, efforts to mitigate the extent and the speed of this temperature rise, which we know is going to happen anyway, but the efforts to do this might, as Forbes magazine and as John Sununu have said, be very costly. They certainly will require many changes in the ways that we have of doing business, changes in our energy policy, in our agricultural policies, in our industry, changes in population policies, in development, and of course changes that will affect all of us in our consumption patterns. In addition, since energy, which is the major source of the greenhouse gases through fossil fuel combustion, it's essential to development of countries like India and China and others. India and China alone account for 40% of the world's population. But if these countries are to satisfy their legitimate aspirations to improve their very poor standards, they're going to need energy. And unless economical alternatives are available, it's going to be very difficult to persuade them to forego this. Nevertheless, I would suggest that the problems of greenhouse warming do share some of the attributes and some of the issues that we faced when we were looking at the ozone layer. We were facing dangers that would affect all nations and all life on Earth, and that were beyond the normal time horizon of politicians. There were entrenched economic interests who claimed that any regulations, any controls, would impose enormous economic and social costs, unemployment, everything that we read today in the headlines. And they insisted that no controls would be tolerable, that they couldn't possibly come up with solutions. And in fact, there were no technological solutions to replace CFCs, except for aerosol sprays, but for the other uses there were none. And when we designed the treaty, we, I would submit, had real faith in the market system, because we did not rely on best available technologies, which has been a traditional concession to economic and commercial interests. We simply gave industry a deadline and said, as of this date, you're going to reduce chlorofluorocarbons. I had faith in Yankee ingenuity. I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School across the river, and I know that the one thing that industry does not like is uncertainty, and if you give them a bit of certainty, why, they'll then get down to the job, and in fact, as you all know, it's happening. At the time of the negotiations, a number of governments were allowing commercial self-interest, international competitiveness issues, to influence their scientific positions. Of course, we don't know about that happening nowadays on the climate issue, do we? They were not only letting that happen, but they were using the scientific uncertainty as an excuse to delay hard decisions. And in fact, many political leaders at the time were prepared to accept these long-term environmental risks rather than impose the short-term economic costs, which were quite certain, that were entailed in limiting products that were so essential to modern standards of living. Now, all of this is very familiar as we face the climate issue, and we have to admit that these short-range political and economic concerns are indeed formidable obstacles to cooperative international action that's based on arcane theories and scientists. But I think there are a number of lessons. I'd like to just very quickly tick off some of them for you. There are some lessons that we learned in that experience in negotiating the Montreal Protocol. It stretched out over a period of years, by the way. There was not just one conference. There was a series of meetings, of workshops, and they resulted in 1987, as I said, in a successful treaty. The first point that I think we have to keep in mind when we look at the Montreal Protocol as a precedent for climate change is the importance of science and of scientists. Science really was the driving force behind policy, behind international policy on solving the ozone depletion problem. And in this, we had to get the scientists out of the laboratory and into the political arena. It was sometimes a bit uncomfortable for them. They couldn't give us certainty, but at least we wanted them to try to narrow the bands of uncertainty and to try to come up with an internationally accepted commonality of data and of the basic parameters. And we wanted them as well to accept, to share some responsibility with the diplomats and policymakers for the policy implications of their findings. As I say, this was not for them often a very comfortable role to play, but it was absolutely vital. And certainly as the leader of the U.S. delegation, I can say that I am deeply indebted to the scientists from NASA and NOAA and from the universities who advised me and who were very much a part of our negotiating position and of our eventual negotiating success in persuading the greater part of the rest of the world to agree that there was a problem that required strong measures and not simply a symbolic treaty. Governments, for their part, and this is the second point, must nevertheless be prepared to act while there is still substantial scientific uncertainty when they're faced with problems of this type. There can never be scientific certainty, because if we wait until the harmful levels of ultraviolet radiation are actually recorded, if we wait until the rate of species extinction accelerates even higher, if we wait until the temperatures have risen to the point where glaciers melt, thereby proving the theory, it's too late. It's too late to avoid very serious harm to humanity, to lives, and draconian costs. And so, in a way, what we did at Montreal was something we all do in different contexts. It was an insurance policy. We weren't sure, but we decided we needed to do something. And as you all know, 6 months later, the evidence became then virtually irrefutable. Even our Secretary of the Interior, Don Hodel, had to admit that hats and sunglasses would not be enough to protect us from a declining ozone layer. The third element that came out of my own experience in negotiating this treaty was the real importance of public opinion, of an educated electorate, in putting pressure on often hesitant politicians and in taking actions themselves. One must never underestimate the power of the consumer. Back in 1975, just after the ozone theory was published, in the United States, the market demand for aerosol spray cans dropped by 2/3 before the EPA put in any kind of government regulations. And this happened because of tens, maybe hundreds of millions of individual decisions by American consumers in going to their supermarkets and going to their drugstores and not buying those products. And they gave a very clear signal to my friends in industry, and sure enough, it wasn't long before there was competition and people came up with alternates to CFCs as spray can propellants. So I think that educating and mobilizing public opinion is a very important aspect as we look at the global warming issue. Another point is that strong leadership by a major country can be a significant force for mobilizing an international consensus. We really faced at that time the opposition of most of the civilized world and the indifference of the rest of it to this particular issue. And it was the United States, which is the leading emitter both of chlorofluorocarbons and of greenhouse gases. We took the lead on that, and we had credibility because we did take the lead and because we were the country that was doing the most harm. And I would say that our influence in achieving that treaty was very significant, and I would also say that the world is waiting for us, is expecting us to take a similar leadership role on climate change. And as someone who is still associated with the State Department, I am personally sorry that this has not occurred yet in any meaningful way. I'd also, I think this is the fifth point, point out that an international organization can play a crucial role in these kinds of international multilateral negotiations. In the case of the Ozone Protocol, it was the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and its very forceful director, Mostafa Tolba, who is an Egyptian scientist. I'd like to point out that a treaty in this area must deal with economic inequalities. This is the famous North-South issue. The countries of the South, although they have these enormous populations, they didn't cause the problems. We caused the problem. And we are still causing it. And anyone who says, let's delay action on climate change, on limiting greenhouse gases, until we can persuade the third world to join us, I say that's just a formula for delay, because their problem, their contribution to these issues are potential. They're not real at the moment. Right now they're consuming relatively little in the way of chlorofluorocarbons. They're emitting relatively little in the way of greenhouse gases compared to the industrialized countries. And among the industrialized countries, paramount is the United States. We use more energy and we waste more energy per GNP and per dollar of GNP and per capita than any other country, and it's incumbent on us and the other industrialized countries together to take measures first. And then after that, we're going to have to transfer the technology to the Indias and the Chinas to enable them to take up their share of the responsibility. Well, to conclude, I would suggest to you that there are always going to be ambiguities in the real world of international relations. There are going to be political uncertainties, economic uncertainties, scientific and psychological uncertainties. But if there's one thing that the Montreal Protocol has shown us, and I feel this is a hopeful sign, it is that under certain conditions that the international community can take preventive actions that are difficult for the benefit of future generations. And for this reason, it may well be that the Montreal Protocol is a useful precedent and a hopeful precedent as we approach this more complex issue of climate change. But I'd leave you with the last word that it isn't only the governments and it isn't only the UN institutions that play a role, that all of you, as individuals, as citizens, as voters, that you have a critical role in pushing governments to make the right decisions. And I hope that you will take that away with you, and when you vote and when you look at your environmental organizations, that you try to, when you look at your own lifestyles, because it all begins to add up, that you try to keep this in mind and to really realize that you can individually, multiplied, make a difference in these issues. Thank you.
Well, I think we ended with a marvellous story of how one can get constructive answers, but also, of course, Richard Benedict reminded us of our own lifestyles. And I'm bound to say that every Sunday when I throw away 4/5 of the Sunday newspapers and can hardly carry them, I wonder just how many woodlands we're cutting down every Sunday by our insistence upon wasting quite so much paper on quite such trivial material as we do. We now open this evening for questions, and I'd be grateful if anybody coming to ask a question, there are microphones here and above, would you please indicate if there's a particular member of the panel that you want to address your question to? And would you kindly give your name to start with? Please, sir.
John Barrett. I'd like to address Professor Clark. You've probably heard the story about the Roman Emperor Nero, who's supposed to have fiddled while Rome burned. I'd like to ask you specifically about the situation in Acre and Rondônia provinces in Brazil, and to what extent politics and economics and international relationships come into what's going on there, because there's a very extensive burning of forests that are both species rich and harmful as far as the greenhouse effect is concerned. So how can the developed and rich nations share the burden? Should we put all the burden of changing the system on the indigenous people, or can we share that burden? You mentioned toward the end of your remarks the role of people here at the university. I was talking last week with an anthropologist who works in Borneo, and we were discussing the possibility of biology and life science students coming here from third world countries. And he said in many cases there are language barriers that many of these students from Indonesia or Brazil may have a problem about language if they wanted to study here at Harvard. There may be a need to expand life sciences here at Harvard, perhaps give tenure to some of the junior faculty.
Bill.
In the name of all recently tenured junior faculty, I thank you. Let me just pick off the top one of that. I suppose the air photographs of Rondônia, and the sequence of 1 year after another, the increasing footprint, as it were, of the deforested areas is, if we need one, the image of deforestation in the humid tropics. To the extent that I understand the studies that have been done of that area, you have, as always, a mix of factors intervening. You have what in almost every other context of rural development is recognized as a good, that is, the availability of transport. Availability of transport has been called the first three requirements of getting rural development moving. Availability of transport simply made those areas accessible. They made it possible for individuals, and there certainly are some autonomous individuals involved in that, to get into areas they otherwise couldn't have reached. It means at their disposal and try to make a living out of them. Unfortunately, the kind of living they're making out of it is one that I think most opinion would say is unsustainable economically and environmentally. I guess also, unfortunately, one can at least make an argument with in fact, the argument is made very vigorously within Brazil as to whether the government subsidies, or government plus World Bank subsidies, to build those transportation nets are a wise choice of investment of limited resources in Brazil on purely economic grounds, much less on the grounds of what they do environmentally. But as I understand the issue, it's not easy to point in that case to either just self-serving government policy of a bunch of people going after subsidies or just population pressure. It is certainly, or just the World Bank going in the wrong direction. It's a complicated situation, and there are rather limited things that the United States or any other developed country can do short of broad-based approaches to promoting development in those countries.
Thank you, Bill. Please.
As was pointed out...
Could you give your name? Sorry.
I'm sorry, my name is Tim Wilkins. As was pointed out, Mr. Sununu is not much of a scientist, but I think he may be a fairly savvy politician. He pointed out a couple of weeks ago that the American people would have to give up substantially if we were to control greenhouse gas emissions. For example, we might have to give up our cars, and he thinks that the American people don't want that. Dr. Clark pointed out that information can help solve this problem. Dr. Benedict pointed out that with ozone, the demand for CFCs fell. But what can we really do to convince the American people to conserve? Is there a role for government, and if so, what role should they take in that?
I'm sure the other panelists will have something to say. Sometimes when one I personally yearn for a Franklin Roosevelt which most of you just know by reading about him, but to deliver the famous fireside chats when he would, that was during the depths of the Depression, which I think was a comparable kind of challenge or issue facing our national society. We need that kind of leadership. Someone at the top who will tell us, who will talk to us straight, who will not pander to our weaknesses and to our foibles, but rather to the noble side of us. And will say, look, this is a situation and these are things that need to be done. Now, I personally feel that a lot of what's required, certainly initially, to stretch out this greenhouse effect, we're not going to be able to stop it, but we can stretch it out. And I not only have this naive faith in private enterprise, I also have a naive faith in scientists, you see. And I think that if we can stretch out this global warming, that technology, that we'll get something that will help us to adapt to the global warming that will take place, but not at the rate it's going now. And there are measures we can take short of doing away with automobiles, which I think will get us a substantial way down the road toward stretching out the greenhouse warming effect. And a lot of them, I think, are measures that would be good for us and that will be healthy. For example, not sitting in an overheated auditorium like this one, where I've had to even loosen my three-piece diplomatic suit before I go out into the cold. I don't think that's healthy, actually. I think it's better if we'd sit here and and have to wear our sweaters, and the same thing in the summer, not have to go from a freezing cold interior out into a Washington tropical forest. I think that these kind of things could be told to the American public. Certainly we were able, at least temporarily, to do without our underarm sprays and our hair sprays and give industry a chance to come up with solutions.
Bill?
Yeah. The way you pose the issue is unfortunately the way Mr. Sununu posed it, and just as Ambassador Benedict has said, the obscenity of that is in place of beginning a discourse that tries to lay out the tough, difficult choices involved. We get straw men thrown up of you'll have to give up your cars. Well, come now. Nobody is talking about we either do the greenhouse effect or we have an America with no automobiles. What they're talking about is giving up certain models that certain companies would like to sell you, yes. Certain kinds of driving habits that at least certain people would like you to have because it's in their interest to do so, and certainly certain forms of cars that some of us choose to own. But no more than the CFC debate was over giving up solvents, refrigerants, and propellants is the greenhouse debate about giving up cars. It's about making some choices about which kinds of personal and public transit we're going to use. And what we need coming out of a White House is not that sort of posturing, but the sort of laying out, not Mr. Sununu knows what choice we want to make, thank you. I'm sure he knows what choice he wants to make, but rather what choices we have and what kinds of things they might get us. And it's that kind of leadership that right now we have no one in a senior position in this country willing to take.
Michael?
Briefly, I think that I agree with both of the previous speakers. I think there's a very urgent need for informed, honest debate on these issues. And I think what we really have lacked up to now is honesty in the debate. We have always posed a non-problem, or a problem that is not really the issue at hand. In the case of the presidential election, it was Boston Harbor, the backdrop for a discussion of environmental issues. And it seems to me very important to really focus on what the issues with global warming are as they relate to the automobile. The United States, with 5% of the world's population, produces almost 25% of the carbon dioxide attributable to fossil fuel burning. We drive our cars with gasoline that sells at less than $1 a gallon, when our European economic competitors pay $4 a gallon for gasoline and do quite well. We need, it seems to me, an economic policy which uses the free market system to encourage conservation. We can't simply just preach the ethics of conservation. It seems to me the market system is the way to bring it to bear. And then I also share Ambassador Benedict's confidence in the ingenuity of our system of government and private enterprise. We will develop solutions that will be sensible and environmentally constructive.
Professor Wilson.
Al Gore pointed out in reference to this type of reasoning that once you've agreed upon regulation, a strict form of regulation, as followed the Montreal Protocol, that you said no, then everyone is on a level playing field in terms of innovation. And the great energy and creative genius of American industry and technology is set loose looking for the alternative, because that's where the money will be made, and often the alternative can prove to be the superior one economically as well as environmentally.
Thank you. Gentleman up there.
Yes, my name is John McLean, and I have a question for Dr. Clark and perhaps Dr. Benedict. It concerns cost-benefit analysis, and I am aware of a couple of cost-benefit studies that have been published recently emphasizing the costs of reducing U.S. CO2 emissions, and I expect that more will be published soon, and I'm wondering whether you think cost-benefit analysis, as it's currently being practiced, is serving us well, and how you see the limitations of that tool of economic analysis. Do you think it can be used to advance these arguments for reducing U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and what other broader philosophical arguments outside the bounds of cost-benefit analysis do you think can be forwarded to counter its influence?
You want me to both answer that question and walk back into my office in this school tomorrow, eh? I think that the systematic comparisons of saying where do we get the biggest return for expenditure of scarce resources, there's no possible way to argue with that as a good rationale for applying to most any choice problem. Where we get into trouble is not with the fundamental notion of looking for efficiency in allocation of resources, but where we begin to apply very fine-tuned methodologies to pretty crude strategic issues. I think it may be useful to point out, and Pastor Benedict will know more about this than I, but it's interesting that back in the mid-70s, when we did round one on the fluorocarbons and other ozone depleters, virtually every government study done, the one done by the Department of Transportation, the ones done by the National Academy of Sciences, the ones done by the Dutch and the Germans, focused at great length on what would be the costs of the impacts of allowing certain levels, nominal levels of depletion of the ozone layer, and something on what would be the costs of switching out of the various uses of ozone depleters we were using. And though consensus began to emerge on the science, absolute cacophony existed in terms of the debates over those impacts, simply because the science was nowhere near up to the matter of estimating what, in a quantitative, global sense, the effects on agricultural crops, on human health, and so on would be, even if we could have then added them up afterwards. And it, in several different rounds of the 1970s ozone debates, simply brought the argument to a dead stop, because the people who didn't want to do anything anyway could say, look at all this argument and so forth. It was very interesting that as we moved into the debates in the 80s, the quantitative, global, integrative assessment of the costs of letting the ozone shield be thinned virtually vanished from the discussions. What we had was a generally accepted social consensus that a lot of ozone depletion just can't possibly be a really great thing to have if there were a way not to have it without going bankrupt. So we started looking pretty hard at ways not to have it without going bankrupt. And I think as we look at a whole set of environmental issues, we see that in terms of actual practical policy, as opposed to what academics in unnamed policy institutions do, it's very important to discuss impacts, very important to discuss differential effects of various policy measures we might take. but very often action devolves from an emerging social consensus that this is actually something we oughtn't to be doing, if we can possibly find a route out of it. And then the route for solutions goes on, and we tend to pick, of the solutions, the ones that seem to be least costly in political or economic or whatever terms. I would not be surprised if that is indeed the path we see being followed out in the greenhouse issue. I'd be interested, in fact, in Shirley's response to this as well. It's your turn.
Well, it's Dr. Benedict first.
Well, very, very quickly, listening to the question and to Bill Clark's response and reflecting on my own experience, I had a thought which I'd like to share with you tonight, and in fact to promulgate what I might call the first law of environmental economics, and that is that industry almost invariably overestimates the costs of adjusting to environmental protection. I don't know why this should be so, but somehow it seems to be an unvarying law, so we might consider this as almost a given. When the research and development begins to take place and when competition enters the field, somehow the costs go down. I think, and Bill Clark mentioned this earlier, I think we're not well served by our current tools of economic analysis. That it's a false dichotomy that Sununu and others are posing between economic growth and environmental protection, because without environmental protection, you're not getting economic growth. The fault is in our indicators, which seems to suggest that the more you pollute and the more you have to spend to clean up the pollution, that your GNP is thereby growing. This is all a contribution to gross national product. I think that we need to, one of the major items on my agenda personally, and what I would recommend if I were in the White House now, is that we get on with some more responsible and realistic economic accounting. And that also includes present value methods, because when you apply a present value discount rate, any future cost, let's say the cost of some harmful impact from climate change, any future cost can be reduced to insignificance if it's far enough in the future, and depending on the discount rate. There's something wrong with that method of analysis. I can't quite say what it is, but I can't quite say how to remedy it. But I think that we ought to put some economic minds to work as well as the atmospheric chemists.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'd only add 2 sentences, and that's because I'm old enough not to mind whether my office is there in the morning anyway. The first sentence is that we haven't built in the time dimension to cost-benefit analysis. Clearly, if one takes a very long-term view of cost-benefit analysis, one comes out with very different answers than if one takes a relatively short-term view. And I agree with what Dr. Benedict and others have said, that basically the political cycle is a short-term cycle. It's basically as long a cycle as to the next election and not much beyond. But secondly, I think that Bill hinted at this, that our accounting methods are quite extraordinarily defective. If you take one example, we do not allow for accounts to show the increase in assets due to the improvement of human resources. They're not even reflected in our accounts. And of course, what are not reflected in our accounts are the non-direct costs of some of the environmental effects of what we do. If you start accounting for those, your whole cost-benefit analysis fundamentally changes. So nobody should kid themselves that cost-benefit analysis is a value-free tool. It is not. The crucial thing about it is that its values are implicit and not explicit, and therefore many of us like to pretend there are no values embedded in it at all. Now, having said that, let me turn to my next questioner.
A question for Mr. Benedict. My name is Chris Waltz. In order to deal with some of the issues such as CO2 emissions that have transboundary effects, what do you see as some of the existing international institutions that can mediate and play a role in finding solutions? And where there are shortcomings, what sorts of international institutions do you think will be needed to deal properly with this issue?
As I mentioned earlier, I think that the United Nations Environment Program does have both the mandate and the leadership to play a central role in coordinating international negotiations in the environment generally, and in particular on climate change. They can be assisted by the World Meteorological Organization, which is basically a scientific organization. It's much narrower in scope. And I think that we'll need to supplement that with perhaps creating some kind of a standing secretariat. I could see something like the disarmament negotiations, because it's not something that's going to be solved in 1 year or 2 years. I could see a standing secretariat staffed principally by UNEP and WMO and perhaps other United Nations agencies, and maybe experts lent from governments and from other institutions, that would be a secretariat for a series of negotiations on individual aspects of the climate issue. I would not try to solve everything at once in one big global kind of treaty. I think there should be a framework. I would see a framework convention, and then I would see individual protocols, for example, for the transportation sector, or for fossil fuels, or dealing with forests. And these could all be taking place at their own pace, but within a common framework of a common secretariat. This is one way I would suggest of looking at it institutionally. It's not by any means the final word, but it's one thing that we might consider.
Our next questioner is up there on the balcony.
Oh. Environmental notebook section regarding the World Watch Institute's 1990 State of the World report, and the first reference was to their concerns with population control. That was the immediate reference that they made to altering the environmental degradation that we're talking about. And the next reference was reusable beverage containers. That was the second reference. And then they went on to list different energy choices, you know, all the things we've read about many times and know about. But I'm just asking, not naively or precociously, if this would be, if you would endorse this sort of a symbol or a gesture that would be, say, more visible than say, an aerosol choice, that the kind of public choices you're talking about having to happen, if this is something like this, would be a good place to begin.
Who'd like to answer? Not Dr. Benedict. I shall pick on Professor McElroy if he doesn't respond immediately. He was looking thoughtful.
I think the population issue is one of three key driving forces, perhaps the most important one, underlying the changes that we're concerned with urbanization and I would say the development of chemical industry and our ability to synthesize compounds for which there's no natural analog and to disperse them in the environment. I would not particularly see a focus on reusable beverage containers as something that deserved high priority in the scheme of things.
We've got 5 more.
And often I think that some of these foci tend to be somewhat misplaced. I mean, there are complicated issues about whether, in fact, you are better off using styrofoam cups or paper cups, or more properly, whether you should take the stand for getting your coffee in a cup that you wash. I mean, I think we tend to often make simple, faddish choices for what the gesture of the moment is to defend the environment.
We've only got a few minutes left, so could I ask our questioners, I think there are still 4, to ask their questions very briefly, and I will also ask the panel to respond very concisely if they would. I think you've been waiting a long time.
We're beginning to see the emergence of free trade zones. Witness the Canadian-US free trade agreement last year, and of course European Community. Both of those agreements explicitly ask for a harmonization of environmental regulations, and yet most of the negotiations taking place around the harmonization has been so far to drive the lowest common denominator down. Perhaps in Europe everyone will have the Italian and Irish environmental standards over the next 10 years. How do we reconcile this perpetual quest for economic efficiency with the need perhaps for a new type of environmental determinism? And I address it to anyone on the panel.
Who on the panel? Yes.
Maybe I'm more optimistic than you, but I think that in Europe that the environmental standards will be the German standards. and I think that'll be very good. And I think that the concept of having a level playing field is a legitimate one, but I would also remind you that the Article 20 of GATT, of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, on Tariffs and Trade, permits trade restrictions if necessary to protect human health and the environment and the preservation of natural resources. And I would be fully expecting that this article will be used more in the future than in the past because of pressure from people like you.
I'm delighted to back that up. I think about 60 Italian and British beaches have been found below the EC standard for sea bathing because of open sewage being poured into the sea, and they're both under very strong pressures to improve the standards. So I think our last questioner may be a bit more pessimistic than some of the rest of us, thank God, are. Our friend over here in the white shirt.
Hi, I'm Jason Fullman. My question is for the panel, but specifically for Professor Wilson. Before I came here, I hadn't heard any discussion of the issue of extinction of species. And even tonight, it seems that most of the discussion has been around the other issues. And you stated that, in your opinion, this is by far, or at least is the most important issue. So I'm wondering why there seems, at least to me, to be relatively little discussion.
Professor Wilson?
This is an institute devoted to Homo sapiens, and I tend to worry about the other 50 million species. Thank you for bringing them back briefly into focus. I said I thought it was the most important because this is the change which is irreversible, and it is a change that is ongoing. We have a very strict time limit. Biodiversity, students of biodiversity like to say the 1990s will be the make or break decade. Although it's possible that there may be a catastrophe effect in global warming, as suggested by Dr. McElroy, a frightening prospect. And thus, I think, gives a greater sense of urgency to the global warming problem. Nevertheless, the other secular trends so far have been gradual, and presumably they can be called back, but species extinction cannot. And the amount of value in these species is something we haven't even begun to plumb. I like to say that in one handful of Earth that you would pick up outside, you have more complexity by far than on the surface of all the other planets combined. And therefore, we, on a longer time scale of 50 or 100 years, if we let this particular trend continue, it is the one that's most likely to be regretted by our descendants and lost opportunities and savagely wasted heritage.
Please.
I'm Chris Granda, and a question for Ambassador Benedict. While it seems to make sense that the first world take unilateral action in the short term to mitigate the current effects of our emissions of CO2 and other gases on the global climate, it also seems that in the long run, any stable solution must also involve multilateral decision-making with the third world. That, to me, implies a different kind of global economic order. And I was wondering whether there are any hints about the form that negotiations towards that order might take that come from the Montreal Protocol.
Well, I don't happen to subscribe to the theory that the environmental crisis now is the greatest boon for the third world since the new international economic order. This is going to be the great excuse for them, and the Swiss bankers are already rubbing their hands with glee about all the new numbered bank accounts that they'll be able to open as these resources somehow find their way where they so often do. I think that we are going to have to help the third world. I said that, but I don't think it's going to be a blank check. I think that we will be able to look very carefully at what the needs are and to specifically find ways of transferring technology and financial resources. I don't think the third world should be disadvantaged by taking up their share of the responsibility, but I don't see it as requiring a total change in economic order, and I think that that's what we're seeing now in the Montreal Protocol. There is now very serious attention being paid to technology transfer beyond just vague promises. There will be a requirement for additional resources. I fully endorse that. The third world has often resisted this, saying there should be no conditionality, but there has to be additionality. My answer to that is that there has to be additionality and conditionality.
The last question, please.
My name is Peter Walker. My question is addressed to anybody on the panel who wishes to answer it. The question is, as was mentioned earlier, the bulk of the deforestation that occurs in developing countries is caused not by corporations, but by people who have no other choice, either for clearing land to plant or to cook their food. And also, as was mentioned, the long-term solutions to that problem are population control and economic development. But in the interim, I wonder what specific policies can developing countries with limited budgets take to give those people other options?
Who would like to, Professor Wilson?
Again, this is the kind of simplistic. I mean, I'm not criticizing you for it, but it's a commonly asked question. The kind of simplistic Sununu type distinction that's made. Can't save the forest because the people have to have somewhere to go. Well, there's a long list of alternatives that can be worked out, and which are within the grasp now of the biologists and agricultural scientists. And they include better use of land already under cultivation. 2/3 of the soil underlying these rainforests is of a nature that cannot be used for more than 3 or 4 years. That's the reason, basically, for the great destruction of the Amazon. But much of the land that's already been cleared can be kept in cultivation and productivity greatly increased. We need also capital investment to prime the pumps of new markets for the immense number of products, including crops, pharmaceuticals, and the like, that can be brought out of these countries. And I think that's one area where the assistance community and the business community and the governments of the first world should pay a great deal more attention in helping to develop those markets and to conduct the research that puts the products that are I think will be readily available in these forested areas for use, such that forest and other natural habitats can be sources of sustained yield, and also sources of species that can be then grown commercially in denser quantities outside of the wildlands.
In thanking our panel, may I add just one sentence to that? I remember traveling literally hundreds of kilometers across Brazil, mile after mile of country which was arable, and where the landlord was absent and had been absent for many years, and where much of the land was going back to weeds, miles away from the Amazon. And when I got to the Amazon, I found the landless peasants cutting down the rainforest, and as Professor Wilson said, planting coffee, and after 3 years looking at an absolutely arid soil that wouldn't bear another crop for 20 or 30 years. So I think land reform has some part of the answer. But let me now thank our panel, because I think you are listening to 4 men, all of whom have in their way contributed immensely towards the solution of this extraordinarily difficult problem. And any one of us would be proud, I think, to have done what Professor McElroy, Professor Wilson, Ambassador Benedict and Bill Clark are doing towards the solution of this problem. And I would conclude in thanking them, and also Henry Lee, who helped to organize this evening, with the words that come from a poet, Dylan Thomas, the famous Welsh poet. who concluded one of his poems by saying, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. My worry is that we will be so complacent that we will let all this happen." Thank you and good night.